A long, dark highway stretches across the Kansas plains. In a beat-up car, two men are driving through the night. They are chasing a fantasy, a tale of a rich farmer and a safe stuffed with cash, whispered to them in a prison cell. For Dick Hickok and Perry Smith, this is their ticket to a new life in Mexico. For the four people sleeping in the farmhouse at the end of their journey, it is a death sentence they don't know has been passed. This story isn't just about a crime. It's about the moment two paths violently collide. The path of a prosperous, respected family living the American dream, and the desperate, broken path of two ex-cons speeding toward them on a road with no return. Our story begins not with a bang, but with the quiet, ordinary rhythm of life. It's November 14th, 1959, a Saturday, in the small town of Holcomb, Kansas, population about 270, the day unfolds with a gentle predictability. The sky is a vast, open blue over the flat wheat plains. The air is crisp. For many, it's pheasant season, a time for friends and family to be outdoors. At River Valley Farm, just outside town, Herbert Clutter is already at work. At 48 years old, Herb is the picture of success and stability. He's a graduate of Kansas State University, a respected member of the local Methodist Church, and the owner of a thriving farm that's a model for the entire region. He's the kind of man who built his life from the ground up, known for treating his employees fairly and for his deep involvement in community affairs. Today, like most days, he's dressed neatly, probably in khakis and a button-down shirt. He doesn't smoke or drink. He's a man of principle and habit. His wife, Bonnie Fox Clutter, is 45. Those who know her describe a gentle, kind woman, but one who has struggled for years. Friends and family said she battled bouts of deep sadness and various physical ailments, a fact that cast a subtle shadow over the family's otherwise bright picture. She spent a lot of time in her room, but today is a good day. She's feeling well enough to help with the household, to be present. Their two youngest children are home. Nancy, who is 16, is the darling of Holcomb. A junior in high school, she's a straight-A student, the president of her class. She plays the clarinet in the school band. She's deeply involved in the 4-H club, loves baking and horseback riding, and on Sundays, she teaches a class for younger girls at the Methodist Church. That very afternoon, she's baking a cherry pie. She has a date later, not a real date, she would insist, but just a ride to the 4-H meeting with her steady boyfriend, Bobby Rupp. Her brother, Kenyon, is 15. A sophomore, he's quieter, more introspective than his popular sister. He's a tinkerer and a builder. His current project is restoring an old pickup truck his father let him buy, even though he's too young for a license. He's interested in woodworking and hunting. Like Nancy, he's a dedicated member of 4-H on this last day. He's likely in the basement. In the playroom he helped fix up, working with his hands, lost in the focus of a project. The two older Clutter daughters, Ivana and Beverly, are grown and live away from home, starting families of their own. Their absence on this weekend is just a normal fact of life. The day proceeds. Nancy finishes her pie. Herb goes about his farm business, maybe checking on the prized fruit trees in his orchard. He might have driven into Garden City, the county seat 7 miles east, to run errands. He cashed a check recently, a $60 check. It was a routine transaction. He preferred to do business by check, a fact well known to anyone who dealt with him. He rarely carried large amounts of cash. In the evening, Bobby Rupp comes over. He and Nancy watch television in the den with Herb and Kenyon. It's a simple, wholesome scene. Around 10 p.m., Bobby says his goodbyes. He is the last person outside the family to see the Clutters alive. He later recalls nothing out of the ordinary. Herb Clutter, ever the gentleman, likely saw him to the door. The family retires for the night. The house, a spacious white home on an acre of lawn, settles into darkness. The doors, as was the custom in Holcomb, are almost certainly unlocked. But 400 miles away, in the eastern part of the state, a different story is violently unfolding. In the city of Olathe, Perry Edward Smith is waiting. He's 31, a small, compact man with legs permanently damaged and aching from a terrible motorcycle accident. His life has been a relentless series of hardships. Born to a broken family, his childhood was a nightmare of orphanages, abuse, and constant moving. He's a dreamer in his own way. He reads, he paints, he writes poems. But beneath that simmers a deep, volcanic anger and a lifetime of humiliation. He's waiting for Richard Eugene Dick Hickok. Dick, 28, is his opposite in many ways. Where Perry is brooding and sensitive, Dick is glib and outgoing. He was a popular athlete in high school, but his life was derailed by a catastrophic car accident that left his face disfigured and, according to his own brother, changed him into a darker, more bitter person. He turned to writing bad checks and petty theft, which landed him in the Kansas State Penitentiary. He's been married and divorced twice and has 3 children he doesn't see. In prison, Dick and Perry shared a cellmate named Floyd Wells. Wells, who had once worked as a farmhand for Herb Clutter, liked to talk. To impress his fellow inmates, he spun tales about his former boss. He described Herb Clutter as a very wealthy man, and he told a specific, tantalizing lie. That Clutter kept a safe in his home office, a safe that, in Wells' telling, held as much as $10,000 in cash. For Dick Hickok, this story was a spark. It became an obsession. He saw it as a cinch, the perfect score. After he was paroled in August 1959, he tried to go straight for a while, working at a body shop. But the idea wouldn't leave him. He contacted Perry Smith, who was also recently paroled. He laid out the plan. They would drive to Holcomb, tie up the family, find the safe, take the money, and leave no witnesses. Then they would flee to Mexico and live a new life. Perry, adrift and in pain, agreed. Now on this Saturday night, their plan is in motion. They meet in Olathe. They have a shotgun. They have a knife. They pack their car with rope, tape, and a set of rubber gloves Dick stole from the hospital where his father worked. They begin the long drive west, across the entire state of Kansas, heading straight for the heart of a community that trusts its neighbors and sleeps with its doors open. They arrive in Holcomb in the deepest part of the night, in the early hours of Sunday, November 15th. The town is asleep. They have no trouble finding River Valley Farm. The house is dark, silent. They approach. They try a door. It opens. The two worlds, the world of the Clutters and the world of Hickok and Smith, have finally and fatally met. Inside, the family is roused from their sleep. What follows is a period of controlled, terrifying order. Hickok and Smith herd Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon into a small bathroom on the second floor. They take Herb Clutter to his first-floor office. They demand the safe. Herb, confused and frightened, tells them the truth. There is no safe. He offers them the little money he has, the wallet from his bedroom, which holds less than $50 in cash, mostly leftover from that $60 check he'd cashed. He pays by check, he explains. He doesn't keep money in the house. The robbers don't believe him. They think he's lying, hiding his fortune. They search the office. They find nothing. Disappointment curdles into anger. This was supposed to be their big score. They, driven all this way, they'd planned to leave no one alive. And now, they had almost nothing to show for it. They bring the rest of the family down from the bathroom. They begin tying them up. They are, in these moments, almost perversely considerate in their cruelty. They tie Bonnie's hands in front of her, not behind, perhaps because of her known ailments. They gag her and put her to bed in a second-floor bedroom. They do the same for Nancy, tying her hands behind her, but inexplicably not gagging her. They lead Herb and Kenyon down to the basement. In the basement playroom, the room Kenyon loved, they tie the teenager to an old couch he had rescued and fixed up. They stuff a pillow behind his head, as if to make him comfortable. In the furnace room next door, they force Herb Clutter onto a cardboard mattress box on the cold concrete floor. They tie him up and gag him. Then Dick Hickok goes back upstairs to search the house again, desperately hoping to find the safe that doesn't exist. Perry Smith is left in the basement with the father and son. Time stretches out. The house is quiet except for the sound of Hickok rummaging through drawers and closets. He finds Kenyon's prized portable radio. He finds a pair of Herb's binoculars. He does not find a safe. He does not find any more money. He returns to the basement, furious and empty-handed. The two men look at each other. They had already agreed no witnesses, but now, faced with the actual human beings they had bound and helpless, they had a choice. They could leave. They had their pathetic haul, less than $50, a radio, binoculars. They could just go. They briefly debated what to do, and in that moment, the fragile control snaps. Perry Smith, the man with the injured legs and the tortured soul, the man prone to fits of rage, made a decision. He walked over to Herb Clutter. He took the knife, and he cut the bound man's throat. Then he picked up the shotgun. He fired a single blast into Herb Clutter's head. The noise must have been thunderous in the confined basement. It was only the beginning. Smith and Hickok then walked into the playroom. Smith shot Kenyon Clutter where he lay on the couch. They walked back upstairs. They entered Nancy's room. They shot her in the head. They went to Bonnie's room. They shot her. In a matter of a few minutes, it was over. 4 lives extinguished. A family erased. Each victim was killed by a single, close-range shotgun blast to the head. The killers were careful. They collected each spent shotgun shell. Later, Smith would claim he stopped Hickok from assaulting Nancy Clutter. Hickok would always maintain that Smith was the one who killed all 4. Smith, in a confession he later refused to sign, first said Hickok killed the women, then changed his story and said he did it all himself because he felt sorry for Dick's mother. The exact truth of who pulled which trigger would become a twisted, contested secret between them, but the result was horrifyingly clear. With less than $50 in their pockets, Hickok and Smith fled into the Kansas night, leaving behind a house of unimaginable silence. The sun rose on a beautiful, bright-skied Sunday. In Holcomb, the horror was still unknown. Nancy Clutter had a standing date to go to church with her friend, Susan Kidwell. When Nancy didn't show up and didn't answer the phone, Susan grew worried. She went to the Clutter home. The doors were still unlocked. She stepped inside. The house was quiet. She called out. No answer. She went upstairs toward Nancy's room. What she found there sent her screaming from the house. She ran to a neighbor, and the police were called. The first officers on the scene were Garden City Police Chief Mitchell Jasler and his assistant, Rich Rolder. What they discovered would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They found Nancy in her bed. They found Bonnie in hers. In the basement, they found Kenyon on the couch in the playroom and Herb on the mattress box in the furnace room. A bloody footprint, invisible to the naked eye, was later discovered in one of Rolder's photographs, a crucial piece of evidence left behind in the killer's haste. The news spread through Holcomb like a shockwave. Disbelief, terror, grief. How? Why? Who could have done this to the Clutters? Herb was admired. Bonnie was gentle. Nancy was loved by everyone. Kenyon was just a boy. There was no motive anyone could see. It seemed random, evil, and utterly senseless. By afternoon, the quiet farm was swarming with authorities. The case was handed to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. The lead agent was a man named Alvin Adams Dewey. Dewey wasn't just an investigator, he was a friend. He and his wife knew the Clutters from church. They had visited each other's homes. For Dewey, this was now personal. He looked at the scene and made a vow. However long it takes, it may be the rest of my life, I'm going to know what happened in that house. The why and the who. He assembled a team. He faced a wall of questions with almost no answers. Robbery seemed unlikely, as nothing of great value appeared to be missing. There was no sign of a struggle. It was as if a shadow had passed through the house and snuffed out 4 lives. The town was paralyzed with fear. Rumors flew. Was it a hired killer, a deranged stranger, someone with a secret grudge? Doors that had never been locked were now bolted shut. Families bought guns. Parents kept their children close. The next day, a group of Herb Clutter's closest friends did a terrible, necessary duty. They went to River Valley Farm with mops, buckets, and detergent. They couldn't let the family's relatives see the house as it was. They cleaned the rooms. They gathered the blood-soaked bedding, Nancy's pillows, the ruined mattress box, the couch from the basement where Kenyon died. They loaded it all onto a truck, drove out into the middle of a stubbled wheat field, doused it in kerosene, and set it on fire. One of the men, Andy Earhart, a lifelong friend of Herb, watched the smoke rise into the big Kansas sky. He thought of his friend's life, all that hard work, that virtue, that success. He wondered how it could all be reduced so suddenly to this, just smoke thinning into nothing. Meanwhile, the killers were far away. Hickok and Smith drove first to Kansas City, where Dick passed some of the bad checks he was known for. The fantasy of Mexico still beckoned. They drove south, eventually crossing the border, but their dream quickly fizzled. They had almost no money. They pawned the binoculars they had taken from the Clutter home. Broke and aimless, they drifted back into the United States, through California, to Nebraska, to Iowa. In Iowa, they stole a car. They were nomads now, living on the run, their perfect score, a catastrophic failure that had left 4 people dead. Back in Kansas, Alvin Dewey and his team had nothing. No solid suspects, no murder weapon, no clear motive. The case, splashed across newspapers from Chicago to Denver, was growing cold. Reporters descended on Garden City, and Dewey held press conferences, sharing the few facts he had, but no theories. The pressure was immense. Then a break came from the most unexpected place, the Kansas State Penitentiary itself. Floyd Wells, the former farmhand who had bragged to Hickok about the Clutter's mythical safe, was listening to the radio in his cell. A news report came on about the murders in Holcomb. As the details were read, the names, the location, a cold realization washed over him. He knew exactly who had done it, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that his prison gossip had provided the spark. Torn by guilt, and perhaps seeing a chance at a reward, Wells went to the prison warden. He told his story. He gave the names, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith. For the first time, Alvin Dewey had real names. He had a motive, however flimsy, a robbery based on a lie. The manhunt suddenly had a direction. The KBI began investigating Hickok and Smith, tracking their families, their known associates. An all-points bulletin was put out for them and the stolen car from Iowa. The net was closing, but Hickok and Smith were still moving. They drove the stolen car to Florida, then west again to Las Vegas, Nevada. They were trying to disappear. On December 30th, 1959, just 6 weeks after the murders, a Las Vegas police officer noticed a parked car. It matched the description from the Iowa theft. He called it in. Within minutes, officers moved in. Dick Hickok and Perry Smith were arrested without a fight. They were taken in for parole violation and driving a stolen vehicle. In their possession, officers found a pair of boots. The boots that would match the bloody footprint from the Clutter home. Alvin Dewey and a team of KBI agents flew to Nevada. They confronted the 2 men. They lied, telling Hickok there was a witness who had survived the Clutter killings. Hickok, falling for the bluff, reacted with shock. Nobody was supposed to be left alive, he is reported to have said. He then pointed the finger at Perry, claiming Smith had done all the killing. Soon, Perry Smith confessed, too. The story poured out. The long drive, the unlocked door, the missing safe, the terrible final decision in the basement. The killers were extradited back to Kansas, to the Finney County Jail in Garden City. The town that had lived in fear could finally put faces to the nightmare. The trial would be swift. The evidence was overwhelming. But for Alvin Dewey, and for a nation about to become captivated by this story, the biggest question was still unanswered. Not who or how, but why. What happened in that basement in the early hours of November 15th? What turns a botched robbery into a massacre? What darkness lives in the human heart? As Dick Hickok and Perry Smith sat in their cells, awaiting trial and almost certain death, a curious, small man from New York City was already making his way to Kansas. His name was Truman Capote. He had read a small article about the murders in the New York Times and was utterly fascinated. He brought with him his childhood friend, Harper Lee, who had just finished a manuscript called To Kill a Mockingbird. Capote didn't just want to report the crime, He wanted to understand it. He wanted to crawl inside the lives of the victims and the killers. He would spend the next 6 years untangling the threads of this tragedy. He would talk to everyone in Holcombe. He would befriend Alvin Dewey, and he would do the unthinkable. He would befriend the killers themselves, especially the complex, tragic figure of Perry Smith. He was searching for the story behind the story, the human truth in the heart of an inhuman act, and that search would lead him and the world into a moral maze with no easy exit. The capture of Dick Hickok and Perry Smith in Las Vegas did not bring peace to Holcombe. It brought a different kind of storm. The two men, handcuffed and hollow-eyed, were flown back to Kansas and locked in the Finney County Jail in Garden City, just 7 miles from the quiet farm they had destroyed. For Alvin Dewey, the KBI agent, seeing them in person was a surreal and somber moment. The abstract monsters from his nightmares were just men, unremarkable, tired, scared men, but the work was far from over. Confessions were one thing, building an ironclad case for trial was another. The community demanded not just justice, but certainty. The evidence was methodically assembled. The boots taken from Smith in Las Vegas were a perfect match for the bloody footprint discovered in the basement. Ballistics confirmed the shotgun shells found at the scene were fired from the weapon they had stolen and later pawned. Their own words in their confessions sealed their fate. The prosecution's case was a fortress, but as the legal machinery geared up, a quieter, more curious presence arrived in Garden City. Truman Capote, the New York writer, had come with his friend Harper Lee. To the locals, he was an odd sight, a tiny man with a high, fluttery voice, dressed in fancy clothes, asking endless, intimate questions. Many were suspicious. This was their pain, their tragedy. Who was this outsider to dissect it? Yet Capote was persistent and surprisingly charming. He won over Alvin Dewey and his wife Marie by being genuinely interested, not just in the crime, but in the people. He didn't just want to know what Perry Smith did. He wanted to know what Perry dreamed about. He spent hours in the Dewey's living room and more hours in the jail talking to the killers. It was with Perry Smith that Capote formed his most complicated bond. Through their conversations, a portrait emerged that was far more troubling than a simple monster. Capote learned of Smith's horrific childhood. Abandoned by his showgirl mother, abused in orphanages, scarred by a motorcycle wreck that left him in constant pain. He was a man who carried a suitcase full of dreams, maps of imagined gold mines, handwritten lyrics for songs, drawings, alongside a well of bottomless rage. He could quote philosophy and then, in the next breath, describe cutting a man's throat. He was, Capote would later say, like a man who, in the act of killing, had also killed himself. Dick Hickok was a simpler study. He remained glib, often making callous jokes about the crime. He blamed Perry for everything, portraying himself as a follower who had lost control of the situation. He seemed to lack the capacity for deep reflection, viewing the murders as a hard-luck story that had ruined his own plans. The trial began on March 22, 1960, in the small courthouse of Garden City. The air was thick with hatred and grief. Every seat was filled with townspeople, many of whom had known and loved the Clutters. Hickok and Smith sat calmly, often passing notes to their defense attorneys. Their lawyers had only one desperate strategy: to argue they were legally insane at the time of the murders, thus unfit to stand trial. To prove this, the defense dragged out the grim, psychological histories of both men. They presented Perry's nightmares and brain injury, Dick's facial disfigurement and personality change after his car crash. But the prosecution had a devastating rebuttal. They pointed to the careful, premeditated planning, the stolen car, the rope, the gloves. They highlighted the orderly way the victims were bound and the killer's cool actions afterward, like stopping for coffee and chocolate milk on their flight from Kansas. The most shocking moment came when the prosecution played Perry Smith's taped confession for the silent courtroom. To hear the killer's own calm, detached voice describe the events, "I didn't want to harm the man. I thought he was a very nice gentleman, soft-spoken. I thought so right up to the moment I cut his throat. Sent a visible shudder through the room. It wasn't the ranting of a madman. It was the chilling recital of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The jury was out for just 40 minutes, guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence was mandatory, death by hanging. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Perry Smith merely nodded slightly. Dick Hickok's face showed no emotion at all. The families of the victims felt no jubilation, only a grim, weary sense of closure. Beverly Clutter, one of the older daughters, simply said, "We are glad they will never be able to do this again to anyone else." But closure was a mirage. An automatic appeal meant the journey was not over. Hickok and Smith were transferred to the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, the very prison where their fatal partnership had been conceived, to await their execution on death row. And so began a long, strange limbo. Not for weeks or months, but for years, 5 long years. In this suspended animation, Truman Capote's project deepened. He became a regular visitor at the corner, as death row was called. His relationship with the killers, especially Perry, evolved into something resembling a fraught friendship. He brought them books, magazines, and news from the outside. He listened. For Perry, Capote became his only link to a world that had long since left him behind, the sole audience for his dreams and regrets. The appeals process dragged on. Lawyers argued over technicalities, mental competency, and the cruelty of the long wait. During these years, a peculiar duality defined the killers. They were the most notorious murderers in Kansas, yet they settled into a mundane prison routine. Perry painted and wrote. Dick lifted weights and schemed about new appeals. They celebrated birthdays and Christmases in their cells. They followed world events. They aged. All the while, Alvin Dewey and the Clutter family tried to rebuild their lives. Dewey remained haunted, rising through the ranks of the KBI, but forever marked by the case. The Clutter sisters, Ivana and Beverly, married and had children, carrying their loss in silence. The town of Holcomb slowly tried to heal, though the lock on the door was now a permanent feature of life. The passage of time began to wear on everyone, even the executioners. A new warden, Sherman Krause, was deeply conflicted about taking a life. The appointed executioner, a former policeman who wore a black hood, suffered nightmares. As the final appeals were exhausted in 1965, the reality became inescapable. A date was set, April 14, 1965, just after midnight. In their final days, the 2 men reacted differently. Dick Hickok, the talker, became quiet and withdrawn. The bravado was gone. He was terrified. Perry Smith seemed to achieve a melancholy calm. He gave away his few possessions. He made a final, poignant request for a single prayer: "Please, just make it quick." On the night of April 13th, a small group of witnesses gathered in the cold prison basement, near the gallows. Among them were Alvin Dewey and his wife, reporters, and official witnesses. Truman Capote was not there. He was in Spain, unable to face the final act of the story he had lived with for so long. At 12:19 a.m., Richard Hickok was led first up the 13 steps. His last words were to the warden and the executioner: "I just want to say I hold no hard feelings. You people are sending me to a better world than this ever was." The hood was placed over his head, the noose adjusted. The trapdoor opened at 12:41 a.m. 33 minutes later. At 1:02 a.m., it was Perry Smith's turn. He walked steadily, pausing at the top to look at the witnesses. He said nothing. The procedures were repeated. At 1:11 a.m., the trapdoor sprang open a second and final time. It was over. The state of Kansas had delivered the justice it promised. But for those who had lived this story from the beginning, the feeling was not of triumph, but of profound emptiness. A double execution could not answer the double why that lingered in the air. It could not bring back a family, or restore a town's innocence, or erase the memory of that quiet farmhouse. Alvin Dewey went home, poured a drink, something he rarely did, and sat in the dark. He later said he felt no satisfaction, only that a heavy burden had finally been put down. When Truman Capote received the news by phone, he broke down. He had poured 6 years of his life into this story, and the two men at its center were now gone. His book, In Cold Blood, would be published the next year to massive acclaim. He called it a non-fiction novel, claiming he had invented a new form of literature. It made him world famous, but it also broke him. He would never finish another major book. He had gotten too close to the darkness, and some part of him never came back. The Clutter family home at River Valley Farm still stands. Others have lived there since. Life, as it always does, has moved on in Holcomb. But the story endures, not as a simple tale of good and evil, but as a permanent, painful question mark. It asks us what happens when chance and desperation collide with order and contentment. It asks us about the ghosts that haunt the American dream and the price of violence, whether it is committed with a shotgun in a basement or a rope in a prison. It shows us that sometimes the search for a why leads us not to an answer, but to a deeper, more unsettling mystery. The mystery of the human heart itself, and in the end, we are left with the echoes. The echo of a shotgun blast on a quiet plains night, the echo of a cell door closing for the last time, and the echo of 4 names, Herb, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon, whose lives were not defined by their terrible end, but are remembered for the light they brought to their corner of the world, a light that was snuffed out in cold blood.